The age-old question that's always on the lips of non-wrestling fans is always, don't you know that wrestling's fake? To which I would say you clearly don't understand how this works. Wrestling isn't fake. Yes, it's predetermined. Yes, it's storyline and pre-written. Yes, a lot of training goes into it, because I dare you to take something as simple as a chop, or even something as simple as running the ropes, and then you tell me if it's fake. Legitimately, running the ropes, if you do it properly, hurts like hell. And nothing could be more real than training to become a professional wrestler. I've mentioned this before, but on my first ever training session to become a professional wrestler, I snapped my ankle on a leapfrog. Accidents happen, and while I personally had no one to blame but myself for that accident, some are slightly more negligent. This is the story of a wrestling career cut short before it could even begin. This is the story of the tragic death of Brian Ong. In order to tell you this story, I need to introduce you to a few entities first. Those being Brian Ong, the wrestling promotion and training school All Pro Wrestling, and a fellow trainee of Brian's named Dalip Singh Rana. Starting with Brian, he was born in Concord, Contra Costa County, California, try saying that 3 times fast, on the 28th of May, 1974. Brian was a young man with aspirations of becoming a professional wrestler. He was formerly an amateur wrestler, therefore obviously wanted to follow in the footsteps of someone just like Kurt Angle. Wrestling training academies and schools aren't exactly the same now as they were back then. Nowadays you can just turn up to a wrestling teaching session, pay a fee, most likely sign a waiver, then crack on with training. For All Pro Wrestling, or APW as I'm going to refer to them throughout this, they held intensive boot camps where students would train multiple times per week, and you would only get in after having your application to join accepted. Brian, in applying for APW's bootcamp, would state in his email that he had dreams of hearing millions of people chant for him or boo for him, and even went on to say that he liked suicidal, homicidal, and genocidal aerial moves, an obvious reference to former ACW star Sabu, who would be announced as all 3 of those things on the way down to the ring. While not the tallest guy ever, standing at 5'7" or 170 centimeters, Brian stated that he was actively working out to compensate for this, with his thinking being that as long as he looked jacked, he'd be able to be taken seriously in the ring. As said before, he was attending APW's boot camp for months, multiple times per week, in order to begin living his dream as a professional wrestler, and while he was doing that, he was working as a filing clerk for the Deloitte consulting firm as his day job to support him in achieving this dream. But that would all very quickly come crashing down. But before we go any further, I do need to tell you about APW. All Pro Wrestling was founded in Hayward, California by a name named Roland Alexander, all the way back in 1991. Initially named Pacific Coast Sports, APW would run shows to a strong local following all the way through the 1990s, even getting some national media coverage thanks to a documentary named Beyond the Mat. 2 wrestlers were there to have a tryout match for the then WWF, and it being filmed for Beyond the Mat helped the company tremendously when it came to people wanting to sign up for the school. Everything was on the up for APW, training notable wrestlers such as Crash Holly, Spike Dudley, Vic Grimes, Cheerleader Melissa, and the next subject of this story. Dalip Singh Rana, born in, I am probably going to butcher these words, Dhirena, Simawa, Himachal Pradesh, India, on August 27, 1972, started his adult life as a security guard before catching the eye of a Punjab police officer. Said officer would help Dalip get a job in the Punjab Police Service in 1993. Upon starting his new life in a new state with a new job, Dalip began training in local gyms. After working for a while in the police service, he would save up enough money to buy his first ever television. And it was there that he would soon after fall in love with the art of professional wrestling. It's then said that a member of the privileged class in India just happened upon Dalip one day while out in India, got him lifting weights, and then chose him to go to America where he would be dropped off at APW and taught how to wrestle. It's alleged that Dallop barely spoke any English, with questions over if he could even read, but the source on this part of the story, Buddy Sotelo, said that the man who discovered Dallop was scarier than any of the other shady characters that he had ever come across in his time in professional wrestling. He even stated that this man saw Dallop as a thing, not a person. But why was that? Well, it was because Dallop suffered from a condition known as acromegaly, with one of the main symptoms being gigantism. Dallop stood at over 7 foot tall and was pretty ripped at the time. I'm sure at this time, those that are in the know will have figured out that this man would go on to become former WWE World Heavyweight Champion, the Great Khali. And from this point forward, I will refer to him as Khali, just for clarity. Now you know the main players of the story, it's time to get into the meat of it. Now, personally, as someone who has been trained in professional wrestling, I can tell you that I started at the same time as a bunch of other people into an academy that had people there of beginner and advanced training levels, and for that reason, we were separated as such. But when it came to anything where it would push us beginners up into a more advanced stage, we were always paired off with more advanced guys because that's just common sense. I wouldn't have trusted taking a suplex from someone who has never done one before, put it that way. Not to mention that if you don't put in the hard work, you're never going to make it. So half-arsing a drill or a sequence isn't going to get you anywhere, and it could potentially lead to you having a reputation as being unsafe. Which is probably why Brian was cited as being one of APW's hardest workers with the right attitude and always being eager to train and learn. On one hand, you've got Brian who, as a former amateur wrestler, already had some form of athletic fine-tuning about him. So when you couple that with his attitude and obvious affinity for high-flying moves, as he outlined in his email to APW, you've got someone that has all the boxes checked to reach for that brass ring. But then on the other hand, you've got Khali, this giant with more muscle than brains, and in terms of his wrestling abilities was greener than grass. With his style often described as stiff and reckless, him barely speaking any English, I'm not gonna lie, this seems like it was a disaster waiting to happen. When I tell you that everything that you could possibly do in a professional wrestling ring is dangerous and then you tell me that it's fake, please, get in the ring. But let me just take you through some of the things that I personally have fucked up on. This move here is known as a bandera. You lift your opponent to the outside of the ring and help them land on the apron. There are two ways to achieve this, either by having both of your opponent's thighs on your forearm and then guiding them over the top rope, or by grabbing both of their thighs and guiding them out that way. The opponent will then land safely on their feet, ready for the next phase of action. Yeah, I didn't do that though. I ran too fast, had too much momentum, and I landed on this bit of the ring. That sucked. That's what the result was. I was lucky that I didn't seriously hurt. I'm lucky it was just a bruise. Another is a springboard. Obviously, this is dangerous because you're flinging yourself up to the top rope and then flinging yourself back off again. Key point here is landing on your feet when you get to the top rope. I, as a 6'2", 250-pound lump of lard, had no right in attempting this, but I did, and I actually had nailed it twice. So I went again, slipped off the ropes, my shins came down on the ropes, and dragged my skin across it. It was like a blunt cheese grater on skin, and there were all kinds of cut up after that. Look, that's the result of both of my shins after this. And also just like watch a couple of these elbow drops. Alright, now watch mine and tell me at what point I get whiplash. Getting into the ring is no joke. You have no idea what could go wrong, from the slightest of mistakes to utter devastation. And unfortunately, this story does take us down the path of utter devastation. At this point in time, Brian and Khali were fairly new to training, with less than 6 months of training between them. Practicing moves is good, it's one of the only ways you'll learn, but you have to know both sides of the move, doing it and taking it. For instance, a suplex. Both of you need to be set up in the exact same way, with your arms hooked round the neck, with the person giving the move either hooking into the waistband of the other person or putting your hand flat against their thigh. From here, the taker of the move will jump, and the rest is up to the person doing the move to guide that person the rest of the way. You have to land with your feet flat. Landing with your legs straight out will more likely than not result in snapped ankles, and yes, I have 100% seen that happen. In this case, it was reported by some sources, the East Bay Express for example, that Khali wanted to practice delivering spinebusters, while others have reported that the move in question that was being practiced was a flapjack. So let's go over both of those moves. The spinebuster has many variations to it, but the most commonly used one is just straight up and down like Batista used to do. You hook one of your arms around the top of the leg of your opponent, tucking your hand into their groin from behind. The other hand will most likely be used to help lift the opponent, either by placing your hand on their back or your forearm under their armpit. They jump, you lift, and then you just send them back first down to the mat. Fairly simple. Whereas a flapjack requires you to hook your arm around the front of the opponent's opposite leg, so if you're grabbing with your right arm, you're grabbing their right leg. They jump while maintaining a straight body. You would then guide them up even further than their jump would have took them, and then you, as the giver of the move, either fall backwards or swipe your own legs out from under you, with you landing in a back bump and them landing in a fairly standard front bump. But here's something you've got to remember. Brian Ong was only 5'7", and Khali was reportedly standing at 7'1". 170 centimeters versus 216 centimeters is a ginormous difference. So why on earth were Brian and Khali partnered together to practice any move, never mind a spinebuster or a flapjack? As the East Bay Express reported, Ong grabbed onto Khali's shirt as he was tossed over the giant's shoulder. Vince Principato, one of APW's head trainers, explained to Brian that he would need to push off his opponent's back as he was tossed. And I would say that's not entirely true. If you're going up for a spinebuster, you want to push off the shoulder, not the back. Because if you're going towards the back, you're in the wrong position. So if you push up on the shoulder, you will be in perfect position for it. Look, this is me taking a spinebuster. I know you can't really see that it's me, but that is me. Anyway, Khali would perform that same move with others in the gym that same night, including one of the trainers, so that Brian could see how to take the move properly, meaning that he had initially been doing this with zero direction. The article does go on to say on the second attempt, Brian grabbed at Khali's shirt yet again, instead of committing to the move, and as Khali came down to the mat with Brian, he reportedly hit the mat tailbone first, which caused his head to snap backwards and slam into the mat. If that's the case, I don't understand how it could have been a flapjack at all. They're the complete opposite way around, with no way to hit your tailbone on a flapjack. Others have reported that it was a move followed by a powerbomb, but again, I don't understand how you hit tailbone first on a powerbomb. You'd be more likely to hit neck first. Brian did not get up after taking this move. Eventually though, he would roll onto his front and complained about being dizzy as well as moaning in obvious pain. But this is wrestling training in the early 2000s. People are bound to get banged up, so no one really took this seriously, with trainer Principato even saying nobody thought, oh, this guy's in really bad shape. Brian would begin crawling his way out of the ring, managed to get himself up onto all fours, and promptly vomited before collapsing. Immediately, someone would call 911 and paramedics would whisk him off to St. Rose Hospital in Hayward, and when he got there, he was pronounced dead on arrival. The coroner's office would list the cause of death as acute subdural hemorrhage due to head trauma. One of, if not the very first thing you'll ever be told when you get in a professional wrestling ring is to tuck your chin. If you tuck your chin like that, on the majority of moves, you will save your head and neck from any form of injury, and then when you add selling on top of it, you can make it look like you've hit your head. Except on a Styles Clash. Never, ever, ever tuck your head on a Styles Clash. That's a one-way trip to disabled town. I'm not sure if Brian was expecting to be dropped on his back, or if being hit tailbone first caused him to panic a little bit, which made his head snap back, or if the force that Khali had used on the move was way too much, but regardless, it resulted in the needless death of a person. I highly doubt APW wouldn't have taught people to tuck their chin. I mean, even Dave Meltzer was once quoted as saying that this was one of the best training schools you could have went to. Many have also agreed with this, with APW being considered one of the best in the business. They were in the business of creating wrestlers who would go on to the big leagues. This wasn't some sort of corny sideshow business. This was just a whole horrendous accident. However, former professional wrestler Tony Jones said in an interview that he had definitely heard that it was a flapjack. He had stated that he had been in Japan at the time of Brian's death, and it was only when he returned that he heard about what had happened. According to him, he heard that Brian already had some pre-existing condition and that could have contributed to his death, and the whole thing had really hit Roland Alexander hard. It is never something you ever think is going to happen. Jones also spoke with Khali following the incident and said that Khali was apologetic over the whole thing. It would be after that Jones states that he heard it was a flapjack that Brian and Khali were performing, with Brian going up for the move, over-rotating, and Khali, probably already in motion, came down on top of Brian, his giant frame landing on Brian's head. Following the death of their son, Brian's parents, Norman and May, filed a wrongful death lawsuit in Alameda County's Superior Court. The Ongs did not believe Khali to be at fault for the death of their son, and instead went after APW and its owner, Roland Alexander. The suit claimed that APW and its owner was supposed to protect Brian, something that it failed to do, going on to claim that no one in APW made any effort to minimize the dangers, even though Brian had sustained a concussion weeks before his death, practicing the same move that later killed him. The Ongs claimed that the instructors of APW just sent Brian back into the ring in complete disregard for his safety. I know it states there that he had a previous concussion, which wasn't reported on prior, but obviously the parents would know, and also Khali wasn't involved in that first concussion. Okay, wait. Obviously the parents would know. Or would they? You see, during legal testimony in this lawsuit, the younger brother of Brian, Edwin, said that Brian had sworn him to secrecy because he didn't want his parents to know what he was doing in his spare time, claiming that it would upset them and wasn't planning on telling them until he signed his first ever professional wrestling contract. This was because their parents didn't understand the pull that wrestling could have on people, saying to them, and I swear this is a verbatim quote from the document, this is not me being racist, I promise. Why you watch that stupid thing? Again, apparently that's verbatim what Edwin said in repeating what his mother May had said. And genuinely, I can understand that. I genuinely wish I had kept my professional wrestling training a secret, because when I told my parents, they laughed. And that hurt. I do have one question though. Where did Norman and May think he had got his previous concussion from? I can't find anything to answer that question, and it's a question mark on the lead up to this lawsuit. But I'm just going to speculate and guess that they had medical evidence to back it up. On the other side of the lawsuit, APW Roland and his lawyers argued that Brian and all of the students in the company had signed liability waivers which relieved APW of any responsibility for any form of injury or accident. The lawyers argued that wrestling is risky. People get into the industry knowing fine well that it's risky and still continue going anyway. However, the presiding judge agreed that Brian should never have been allowed back into the ring while still recovering from a concussion, an action showing negligence on the part of APW and its staff. As such, the jurors of the case voted unanimously in the favour of the Ong family. There have been some speculation as to how much money they received as a result, with PW Insider claiming it to be $1.3 million and Wrestling Inc. reporting that it could be just over a smidge over $2 million. Regardless of what the actual number ended up being, it would never be enough to replace a son or a brother. As a lot of you will know, following on from this horrible incident, the great Khali would go on to some major success in wrestling. He was initially signed to WCW just months after joining APW. I'm guessing his size was enough to warrant a contract. But he never made a single appearance on WCW TV, and his contract was voided after WCW closed its doors in 2001. He returned to APW, and 2 months later, that would be when the horrific accident occurred. He would go on to tour places like Mexico and Japan before joining WWE in 2005, being sent to the developmental territory of Deep South Wrestling in Georgia before he would make his debut in WWE on the April 7th, 2006 edition of SmackDown, the first SmackDown after WrestleMania 22. He would be immediately entered into a storyline with The Undertaker, being sold as an absolute monster in the process. Just over a year later, he would claim the World Heavyweight Championship in a 20-man over-the-top rope battle royal after Edge relinquished the title due to having a legitimate pectoral injury. It would be the only time Khali would hold any sort of title in the company due to Khali not being the best worker, eventually becoming the Punjabi playboy where his character would mostly become a comedic character before he would leave the company, making sporadic appearances over the years and being inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2021. He also owns and runs Continental Wrestling Entertainment, India's biggest wrestling promotion, even becoming its world champion at one point, with two of his wrestling students even going on to the WWE themselves, those being Shanky and Kavita Devi. They didn't last long, but hey, they made it to the WWE, and that's more than a lot many other wrestlers will ever be able to say. Khali was able to go on to make millions in his life, and unfortunately we will never ever be able to know how far or high Brian Ong could have gone or risen. But if his attitude and determination was anything to go by, it wouldn't have been surprising if he made it into the upper echelons of American professional wrestling, or even foreign professional wrestling for that matter. A large portion of wrestling is attitude. It has to be right. You have to know when to play ball, and you have to know when to stand your ground. You can't be a pushover, but you also can't be hard to work with. Wrestling is very political, but if you have the abilities in the ring, you can sometimes leapfrog all that garbage altogether. But unfortunately, due to a negligent accident, Brian Ong was never able to live out his dream, a dream that he, I, and thousands of others have had at one point or another. Rest in peace, man. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.